Welcome to the LB's The Lover of Books author chat. If this is your first time here live or watching a recording, hello. So glad that you're here. Make sure you click subscribe on my YouTube channel, LB The Lover of Books. I have 40 recorded author chats up there with over 7,100 hours watched. So people really like hearing from these fantastic authors. And if you've missed any of them in the past, they're there just waiting on you to see all the ins and outs of their writing process and their books. I'm betting you find something that you've already read right there on that YouTube channel. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think. Now to introduce our very first author of 2024. And yes, we are starting out big. Susan Meissner is a USA Today bestselling author of historical fiction with more than 750,000 books in readers' hands and translations in 19 languages. She's an author, speaker, and writing workshop leader with a background in community journalism. Her novels include this one, Only the Beautiful, The Nature of Fragile Things, both of which has earned starred reviews in Publishers Weekly. The Last Year of the War, named to Real Simple Magazine's list of best books of 2019. As Bright as Heaven, as starred in the Library Journal, and I believe that was a Book of the Month pick as well. Secrets of a Charmed Life, A Fall of Marigolds, which is very popular on Goodreads and Facebook and Instagram. And it was named to the book list top 10 women's fiction titles for 2014. So if you have loved this book and you need to go back to her backlist, there's plenty for you to read. Welcome so much. You're on the Northwest coast, but you were just in Savannah. So thank you so much for meeting with us right after this big festival and all the travel.
No, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this for quite a number of weeks, and my husband and I were just having a really quick happy hour before coming on, and we were eating cheese straws, which I got in Savannah, and I didn't know that I loved them, but I love cheese straws. So it was a good weekend in Savannah.
And I saw you have your own ice cream named after your book as well. Tell us about that.
Well, they did it just for the weekend. It's probably gone back to being just butter pecan, but over the weekend, if you went to Leopold's, it was only the butter pecan as a play on Only the Beautiful, and it was very good.
That's pretty cool to have an ice cream named for your book. I think like you've made it.
Right.
How awesome is it to be able to get back together at these festivals, at the, I know we're on Zoom, but like getting that connection again, has it just been a wonderful change after, that period of time before we were all just closed in?
Definitely. I feel like what we're doing right now on Zoom is wonderful. And maybe we didn't realize how nice it is to get together this way too, because this way is wonderful in its own way. But it sure is great to be back in the flesh, meeting people that you've known only on a flat screen, being able to see people and chat with people that you've known over the past 3 or 4 years, but only via a Zoom room. So they're all really wonderful in their own way, but it was really nice to be there in person.
Well, I have a message from an author that was going to be a surprise guest on this Zoom, but her flight got delayed 2 hours in Denver. Janie Chang, who just wrote The Phoenix Crown, is a great friend of yours, and she was hoping to be here to say, hello, congratulations, love the book, but she said send her apologies. She got delayed, and just to tell you hello.
That's really sweet. That's great. I'll reach out to her and thank her for that. I appreciate that. I know what it's like to travel and have delayed planes. So,
And she's headed, I think, back to Canada. So it's a journey.
Long trip.
All right. Well, let's get going on this story. Where did you first find the idea? Where did it start developing with you?
Yeah, this is one of those books where I know exactly what I was doing when the idea sprang to my mind. I guess you could say I was actually researching to write a different book. I was writing The Nature of Fragile Things, which is that book right there. And that book is set during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And I was looking at very old archived photographs of the 1915 World's Fair, which San Francisco hosted only 9 years after that cataclysmic earthquake and fire. And there was a booth in the education building, and it was the Race Betterment booth. That is actually what they called it, the Race Betterment booth. It was the eugenics booth, and it was in the education building. And it struck me as being very oddly worded. And I had heard the word eugenics before, but I didn't know what it meant in terms of execution. Like I knew there was a eugenics movement way back in the early part of the 20th century, but I didn't know what it entailed. Like, what did it mean? How did it impact people? So I knew when I was done writing the earthquake book that I was going to go back and do kind of a research dive and see if there was a story waiting to be told. And boy, was there.
And what made you decide, yes, there is a story? What was it that you found in your research that said, I'm telling this one?
Sure. Well, the eugenics movement, which it's gone by the wayside, which is great. It was a terrible idea. And the way the eugenics movement was put into practice was even worse. So we don't hear much about it anymore. And so when something that we experienced as collective humanity, when something like that that's rather significant starts to fall out of modern memory, I think we endanger ourselves to the lessons that were learned along the way. So I thought, if there were things we learned about ourselves during the eugenics movement that we need to remember so that you don't carry into the future the mistakes we made in the past, then it's a good idea to tell a story about it. Because I don't write nonfiction, I write fiction. But the thing about historical fiction is when I find an event that I feel like needs to have some light thrown on it, and this is one of those, I feel like it's a way of keeping it in the forefront of people's minds because we learned a lot about how we think during the eugenics movement. We saw it in what we did here in the States, which maybe you'll ask me about, and we saw in what happened in Nazi-occupied Europe, which is eugenic thinking at its absolute worst. And we don't want to forget what we learned along the way. And that was the main reason why I thought, yeah, I need to tell a story about this. It's going to be forgotten by mainstream people if we don't write something that people will read and remember.
That sounds very Helen-like to me, and I'm wondering if you are put yourself a little bit into that character because she said pretty much those exact same words.
I do feel like I resonate with Helen. She's closer to my age. I feel like the way she thought is the way I would have thought had I been in her shoes. Rosanne, the other character in the book, she's much, much younger, far more naive. I feel like in my 60, however many years I am, I think I'm 63 now. I always have to ask my husband how old I am because I'm always forgetting. I think I'm 63. I feel like I've learned quite a bit about humanity in those years. But she's so young. She's only 17. So for me to write as a 17-year-old, and then in the next couple of years that we get to be with her on the page, I really had to do a lot of research and kind of go back in my mind and time. But Helen, I feel like she and I were probably cut from the same cloth. And the reason why she says some of the things that I just told you is I wanted them to be said. I feel like I don't want my books to teach. I don't approach this didactically. I don't want to feel like I have a message or I've got an educational takeaway. I don't want that. But I do want people to experience the past when they read one of my books and take from those pages something into their life after they're done with it, after they put it on the shelf or give it away or take it to their little free library. I want something to resonate with them inside after they're done with it. And I think that's why it mattered to me that what I just told you showed up in the pages of the book too.
Well, I think you were very successful at that because everybody here, I think, is here because it did resonate with them in more than one way. Um, I loved the part when Helen said, she was doing these speeches, but then she decided to write the book. And when she did, it was really because she said it had such longevity that it would tell so many more stories. And I loved the way you talked about that, getting this book in your hands, but then passing it on to a loved one, a friend, a free little library. So someone else can then take this on and take what they need from it as well. It
Well,
really
that's
is a
nice of you
beautiful
to
journey.
say. Thank you. Yeah. You know, um, I didn't know how I was going to kind of wrap things up at the end, and I won't say much. I don't want to spoil it for those of you
Oh,
listening who
we
haven't read
do
it yet.
talk spoilers here. We
You
will,
do?
and
Okay,
they
that's
will
good
get
to know.
upset. I will get
That's
upset if we don't get to hear the nitty gritty. So we talk
appreciate
spoiler and then
that.
everyone's forewarned. So yeah.
Well, that ending at the end, I wrote it three different ways, and it was, this book was a hard nut to crack. I mentioned in the author's note that I had several false starts with it and had to rewrite a lot of it, trying to just find the right architecture and the right way to tell it, and whose story is it to tell, and first person point of view or third person. There were a lot of decisions to make, and I ended up having to um, backpedal on a lot of them. But that at the end there, it felt like with Helen writing the book, that was the best way for there to be a reunion. And it was very important to me that there was a reunion and that there was a happy ending, not because I need a happily ever after, but because the subject matter was so dark and sad and just stunningly terrible that I felt like I needed to give you something that showed you that as awful as people can be to each other in this world, there are also people who try to make it wonderful, and they're there too. And so the way the book ends up with that book with Helen speaking about what she saw and witnessed, that was my way of restoring hope to this whole conversation.
And this is a very weird reference, I'm sure, but it brings to mind Mr. Rogers when he says, I don't know the exact quote, but when things are awful, look to the sidelines because there are people there to help. And Helen is one of those helpers. I mean, she is the epitome of that. And I loved that about her because she did it not only in California, but let's talk about her story, why you decided to pull in the World War II story to as the second half of the book.
Yeah, when I first started researching the eugenics movement, I knew nothing. So I had a lot to learn. And I saw right away the parallels between what we were doing here and what we saw happening in Nazi occupied Europe. It was blindingly obvious that there were parallels between the two. What I didn't know, and which appalled me, was that before Adolf Hitler built one concentration camp, he rounded up disabled children under eugenic thinking, and he killed them. And I didn't know that. And I remember the day I read that, I was just shocked that he rounded it up. And in his words, in his regime's words, because he had lots of people who felt the same way that he did, was they were mercy killings. They were euthanized. And he had all these euthanasia centers all over Germany and annexed Austria, where they were rounding up children who had disabilities and they were killing them. And I didn't want that to be in the book, but how could I not say it? It's part of the story, and it's part of eugenic thinking, this idea that some people are better humans than others. And oh, by the way, we at the top will decide who's better and who's not. And so that's when I decided to make Helen a nanny of a disabled child in Vienna, Austria. Not so that I could shock you or stun you, but so that you could know the truth of how eugenic thinking is a seed that if you water it and tend it, this is where it goes if you just let it grow. And the final solution was eugenic thinking at its absolute worst. And so those parts were hard to read. They were hard to write. I'm sure they're hard for you to read too. But I felt like we needed to know that this is what happened in Nazi occupied Europe before the concentration camps, whose names we all know. This is what happened before all of that was the killing of disabled children because they were seen as genetically inferior human beings.
Now, in the Meyer household, do you really think he didn't know that, because he keeps saying, I was on the army side, like I was on the military side, not that.
Mhm.
Or do you think he was in denial about what was going to happen to his daughter? Like where do you think that fits?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I encourage book clubs to ponder together as they gather to discuss this book. And there's a question in the reader's guide about Johannes and what he did and what he didn't do. And just imagining what could he have done more and like what was he thinking? And I think one of the things that this book delves into, but very subtly, is the difference between complacency and compliant. And what's the difference between being complacent, where I don't care, and compliant, where I care, but I'm too afraid to do anything about it? And I think Johannes is a great example of somebody who was afraid of what he knew to be true. And so he did nothing. And he and Helen have a very interesting conversation late in the book. And I worked on that conversation for several weeks because a lot of my own thinking comes to play in their conversation. It's after the war. She goes to Vienna. It's 1947. The nun at the abbey where she's staying in Lucerne, that nun, that sister, encourages her to go back to Vienna and close this chapter of her life. And she meets Johannes and they have that talk about what he did and what he didn't do. And she accuses him of not doing enough. And everybody kind of has to decide what they would have done if they had been Johannes. Like, if it was me, I wouldn't have stopped. I would have done whatever I could to rescue my daughter out of that place. And he felt like, I can't do anything. I will comply. He's not complacent, but I will comply because I'm too afraid. I'm too afraid I can't save her. I'm too afraid that I might try to save her and risk my own life and I'll be dead. And who will watch out for my other children? So fear is a great motivator. It's not the best motivator, but it's a great one. The other great motivator, just as great, maybe greater and grander, is love. Love is also a motivator. And if you're going to be motivated by one of those two huge ones, is it going to be love or fear? And when you see these two working themselves out in this book, it helps you decide, which one am I going to like? If I had to make really tough decisions, am I going to make them out of fear or out of love? Because I pretty much guarantee you, I think one will lead you to regret and the other will not.
So why did it take you? I understand how difficult those decisions are, but it took you 2 weeks to write that conversation. And I know you wanted to get it right because it's a pivotal point and it is closing that chapter for Helen. So can you sort of walk us through your thought process and as you were going as to how you made certain decisions of why they said what they did?
Yeah, I think most of it was I didn't want to come across as preachy. I wanted it to seem like a real conversation between two people who had witnessed something terrible, really, and had made choices. And I wanted Helen too to recognize her own, I don't know what you call it. She had a role to play too, and she thinks about it. She thinks about it as they're talking when she's accusing him of not doing enough. And he tells her, so says the American, who sat safely and in Lucerne while the rest of the world burned. And so he's kind of calling into question her own, well, what were you afraid of? What didn't you do? And how she's thinking to herself, which is, I think, a question that everybody needs to ask. If you had been alive back then, what could you have done to save just one person? What could you have done to save just one? And she's thinking to herself, she knows there were people trying to swim or take a rowboat across Lake Constance into Switzerland after the borders had closed. Most of them Jewish people trying to flee. And they needed people on the shores, who would clandestinely take them in and get them to safety. But the minute the doors closed on the Swiss borders, she stopped. She couldn't rescue any more disabled children, but she worries that she could have gone to the shores of Lake Constance and looked for refugees trying to survive, and she didn't. And so I feel like, and she also says something to the effect of, if each person had saved just one other person, that's millions of people whose lives could have been saved. And so it's a valid question that she's asking herself, like, what could I have done? What more could I have done? And for us, since it's in the past, you can't undo the past. But for us, it's thinking along the lines of, okay, what will I do? What will I do if I'm ever in the position where I could step in to save another person's life? What am I willing to do? I think it's a good question to ask.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that Helen was flawed. I mean, she starts off her regret by how she dealt with the social worker that came to the door, right? So
Right.
immediately she has some regrets there. But then when she starts regretting what she didn't do in Switzerland, that also makes her more human, right? Because
Yes.
if she would have
Yes.
reacted perfectly, then I think that conversation with Johannes would have been preachy
Right.
because
Right.
she couldn't have been doubting herself.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think too, when she makes the mistake early in Vienna, when Brigitte is taken, part of it was she really felt like she had done Martine a favor by answering all these questions, and I think she kind of wanted to feel like she was validating herself as, a member of the family. And then to have it go so sideways, it's likely that she could not have protected Brigitte from what was going to happen to her. But she feels it so personally that she failed this family. And I think that too kind of helps give her, it kind of rounds out her character in that way, that she feels profoundly guilty for having that happened, because of her, as she sees it.
Yeah, I don't think she could have prevented. I mean, that social worker was coming to get the information no
Right.
matter what. I think that where the real guilt is not telling Martine sooner. And if
Right.
that timing could
Yes.
have
Right.
prevented the
Right. Exactly. Who knows what could have
that's
happened? Yeah, there could have been a different outcome if she had just told her from the get-go.
do you think Johannes was brave or not in his decision with Brigida because she was being tested on horribly?
hmm
And I wonder, does he see that as his own mercy, taking
I
her
would say if we
situation?
could talk to the man Johannes and ask him, he would say that's what he was doing as a father, as a loving father, was preventing suffering. But we don't ever hear him saying to Helen that he said to that same person who he said, just give her the injection and end her suffering. He apparently had an in somewhere with that other person to be
Mhm.
able to say that. He did not say, how can I get her out?
Right.
What do I need to do to get her out? It appears he never asked that question. He was too afraid to ask it.
Yeah. It was a very hard conversation to read, and I'm sure it definitely was to write, but it had
Mhm.
to happen. And I'm so glad that the nun pushed her into that because I think we all needed some closure there before
Yes.
she headed to California. Um,
Right.
so you did decide to split this book half with Rosanne, half with Helen-ish, half. Um, why did you decide to do that instead of overlaying the two?
Mhm. Yeah, I get this question often, and as I was sharing with people in Savannah, I tried all the different ways. It's funny how you think you know the architecture that a book is going to want. Like, I'm a plotter. I don't plot everything, but I usually have a pretty good idea of where the story is going to go and how I'm going to execute the story. And then I'll start writing. And as I said, I had some false starts with this one. And one of those false starts was with the construction. It just wasn't working with having alternating chapters. And so I tried a number of different ways. And in the end, because of the process of elimination, I realized, it's really Rosie's story first, and then Helen's. And then the reader is going to have to stay engaged to see if those stories are going to merge and converge. If you know me as an author, I think most of those readers would say, I know Susan, and she's not going to leave us hanging. If you're new to me, you might have been wondering, I wonder are we never going to know what happened to Rosie? Because it just stops halfway through. But it seemed like not only the best way, but the only way to tell the story with Rosie's chapters. And she gets half of the first half of the book. It's present day, present moment. I'm being taken to this facility. And then a chapter that looks back to how she got to that moment. So those alternate. And then part two is Helen. And we don't really know what happened to Rosie after she left the facility, other than she met that doctor and there was a connection there. And I hoped that was enough for people to hang on to as they read Helen's side of this dovetailed tale, so that when there was that reunion at the end, it wasn't a complete surprise how Rosie ended up marrying that doctor who understood her.
For me, I really appreciated the separateness of it because there were the flashbacks. And
Mhm.
then with Helen, she does too. Quite a bit she thinks back. And so
Mhm.
I think laying those over would have been more difficult to really
Right?
connect with those characters. So I
Yeah.
appreciated it. And I think there was enough connection, but I think the real connector was that Amaryllis. I mean,
Yeah.
as soon as she gets that in the mail and she hangs on to that as her own personal property and gift and love, that now connects. You know, Helen is now connected to Rosie.
Right. Yeah,
What
I usually try to have something in my books that either have dual time or dual narratives. I'd like there to be something that kind of binds the two together, something tangible. In like A Fall of Marigolds, it was the scarf that kind of, united two women who will never meet each other. They're separated by 100 years. They'll never meet. And I like there to be something that brings the two together. And the amaryllis bulb worked on so many different levels. One of which is it's kind of a metaphor that I hoped came out on its own without having to draw too much attention to it. But a bulb flower, they're ugly when they're just in bulb form. You can't even tell what it is. It looks like a dirty old shallot or onion or turnip or something, but inside that bulb is just everything is in it to make it beautiful. And all it needs is to be taken care of. That's all you have to do to an amaryllis bulb to make it bloom in December. When nothing is blooming, is take care of it. Love it like it's spring and it will bloom for you. And that to me was a beautiful metaphor of seeing the potential in someone who on the outside might look like there's no potential there at all. But love that person and watch them bloom. And so I love the cover for that reason, the way the amaryllis around the outsides. I love it that the word amaryllis, and Rosie is a synesthete, so sounds have color. And when she hears the word amaryllis, it creates this beautiful, vivid, color scheme in her mind that will it'll transform her. And she gives that name to her daughter. And the amaryllis bulb came from Helen. So there's all of that, symmetry going on. And I feel like it really draws attention, I hope, very subtly to this idea that within each person is the potential to do amazing things if only we are loved.
I adored this. Like it was really for me one of my favorite things because we did need some light through these dark topics and the amaryllis was always that. It was so telling that of course that hospital was going to throw it away and see it as trash, right? And so you see immediately that reaction, but then she constantly keeps that in her mind of that beauty and hangs on to it for when she's about to have her daughter. I really adored it. I thought it was beautifully done. I don't think it was, I know I hear some fear in your voice that you think it may have been overdone. It was not. And I
Good.
will tell you it was not. That's my opinion. And I'm standing by it. It was just fantastic. And it was
Thanks.
my favorite part throughout the whole thing. I just loved it. Um, did you know immediately it was going to be an amaryllis though?
That is one thing I can't recall why I chose that. I knew that I did want there to be a flower involved, partly because, A Fall of Marigolds, which came out 10 years ago, it had marigolds around, the original cover had marigolds around the border. And the marigold flower in that book was highly symbolic. There was a whole lot of metaphor going on with that book too. And I really liked it and it resonated with people. That book still outsells almost any other book I've ever written, continues after 10 years. And I thought to myself, there's something about what a flower can convey. And it's beautiful on a cover of a book. It draws the eye. And so for a lot of, I guess, those kinds of reasons, I thought, well, what difference does a flower make in this kind of story? And then the more I began thinking, well, what if? Which is the question we authors ask ourselves all the time. Well, what if? What if? And as you begin to tease out, a storyline, it seemed to me that a bulb flower would do that. And I thought, yeah, but you know, Rosie is attracted to sound. It's sound that creates color for her. And a lot of tulip, you know, like tulip doesn't really, to me, that doesn't conjure a beautiful resonant sound. But amaryllis, it does. It just sounds pretty on the ear. And if I was a synesthete and I heard that word, you know, wouldn't I imagine something beautiful? Wouldn't the colors that came to mind be beautiful? And that's why I chose it.
Well, this is the perfect segue to talk about synesthesia because I see people on here that this is where they learned this word, this term, this topic. It doesn't seem to be well known. So, how did you come across it, and what kind of research did you have to do to make it real with Rosie?
Yeah, I don't have it. I actually heard of it like a decade ago, and I thought to myself, that is so interesting. And I usually have a file going of things that interest me. And it may be just the topic, it just something about it pricks my imagination, my curiosity. And I thought, you know, someday I'm going to have a character with synesthesia and I'll use it to tell a story because it's just fascinating to me. And so I saved it. And from time to time, I would look at that article and I would know this is not the book. And then when I realized the eugenic movement was particularly hard on people with genetic kinds of anomalies, if you will, that this would have put a target on Rosie's back if she had it. It was not well understood. It is now. There's, you know, there's way more information about it than there was in the 1920s and 30s when she's dealing with it. It was seen as, you know, highly abnormal, and that which is why her parents, you know, tell her, don't tell anybody that you can do this or you have this because they'll think you're crazy. And of course, Dr. Townsend, who's heard of it, he's got like he's in the know. He's a you know, he's a psychologist. He's he's um he's more knowledgeable than anybody else around her orbit about what this is. But he sees it as a flaw, a genetic flaw. And so, you know, for him, he's like, that we can't have this. This is the exact kind of thing that the eugenic movement would want to rout out, is to get rid of that. And he would see it as actually bettering society, you know, to rid the world of that genetic, as he would think it is, that genetic deformity. And so it did put a target on her back, but it also allowed me to explore this, you know, this condition with you, the readers, and me, and to think about, you know, synesthesia is so very other. If I had made her a deaf girl, that's part of our, everyone knows what that is like, and maybe even know some people who are hard of hearing or are hearing impaired or deaf. But you know, synesthesia is just so other. You would have to pay attention to it because it's just so different. And you would begin to realize right away, just because it's different doesn't mean it's defective. And you know, just because you're deaf doesn't mean you're inferior. Just because you're blind or you're missing a limb or you have epilepsy or you have Down syndrome or any other type of difference, that does not make you defective, inferior, or you know, or any less human than anyone else. And so it seemed to fit this story rather well. I don't have it. I don't know of anybody personally that has it, but I joined a Facebook group. It's a private group, and I figured there'd be a support group for synesthetes out there, and there was. And I just wrote to the admin of the group, and I said who I was and that I'm an author. I want to get it right, and would I be able to join the group just so that I can ask members if there's anybody willing to talk to me. And I think they let me in right away because they want me to get it right too. And so I was let into the group and I was able to post my questions to their message board. And several of them had private conversations with me. I think I spoke to 12. Their names are in the back of the book. And the interesting thing is, I asked all of them, do you wish you didn't have it? And none of them said yes. They
Oh
all
my,
said they can't imagine not seeing what they see. They think we're the ones missing out. And it can be difficult if you're a child and you're in school and you're trying to, you know, live in a world of sound with that now also has color. But you know, they say you learn to adapt, you learn to kind of control the noise, if you will. Yeah, but none of them said they wished they didn't have it.
Well, I love that you were their voice and that this book is also another mechanism to share their stories and
Mhm.
their love of their difference, of their other,
Yeah,
which I thought was absolutely beautiful. Now, on the other hand, Dr. Thompson, we talked about him. I think he saw it as let's rid it, but I think he also saw her as a challenge. His ego got piqued and he wanted to be able to fix her and
right.
first, right? So I think he took special interest because he thought he was so smart that he was going to be able to get rid of it.
Yeah, I think for him, he was kind of my voice of the ruling class. There was a class of people ruling over all of this. Everyone who was a proponent of eugenic thinking, doctors, sociologists, legislators. There are a lot of people who thought this was a great idea. He was kind of like he embodied for me and for you, the reader, kind of all of that ideology, and they really felt like they were doing society a favor by stamping out differences that they felt were inferior. But they didn't stop to think about the fact that they were holding themselves up as judges of what is inferior and what is superior. Like, who decides that? Who decides what is beautiful? You? Do you get to decide what is beautiful? And that's the part where they didn't see it. And they didn't see that they were setting themselves up as judges of what is good and what is not good, which is really kind of a height of arrogance, really. And the sad thing is they had the power to do something about it.
Was there any negative turn for them at any point in history to where they had to pay any sort of price for this or their decisions?
Well, they were all under they all acted under state legislation. So they had state legislation in their favor, and they also had a Supreme Court ruling that set a legal precedent. So they were covered legally, I guess you could say. Their own consciences, I don't know if maybe they came to a better understanding after World War II, after they saw where eugenic thinking can lead if you don't think about what you're doing. Um, I know that some states offered official apologies for state enforced sterilizations. My home state of California did issue a formal apology in the 1990s, a few decades too late, if you ask me, but they did. Maybe other states did too. And just recently, there was a congressional bill for reparation money because I think everybody has seen, like, it's like everyone saw the light, like, this was wrong what we did. And, like, now what can we do to try and make up for the mistakes? And there's really nothing, you can't undo what they did. They did set aside some money as compensation. But the sad thing was that it came so late. Many of these people who were sterilized without their knowledge or consent have died, and they have no heirs. So it's like there's this money that's available, and there's no one there to claim it. And that's what's sad. In Germany, in Nazi occupied countries, there were the war crimes trials, and there were some people brought, before, a judge to answer for their actions. The sad thing is, and I still don't understand this. I tried to find the reason why, and I never could find it. Is none of the doctors who performed who euthanized those children, they were never brought before a tribunal and answered for their war crimes. Not one. I think there were a couple of nurses who were, but none of the doctors. I never understood that.
I don't either. I really don't either. But I do like that authors like yourself are bringing this to the forefront. Mary Ellen just said, "Take My Hand" is another book.
A great book. That's a great book.
Megan Church, The Last Carolina Girl, that also is one that talks about it here and where I live in North Carolina. It's a very important topic, I think, that does need to be discussed and
Mhm.
remembered because we can't forget these things, like you said, because
No.
if it's an
Yeah.
ugly part of our history, right? We don't want to own it. We don't want to talk about it because that's, no, let's forget because we don't want to, so talking about it, I think we need to remember.
Yeah.
This is my signature, Susan. We've got some rapid fire questions for you. Are you
Sure.
ready?
Yeah.
Austria or Switzerland?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Austria or Switzerland?
Oh, let's see. Austria.
Northern or Southern California?
Oh my gosh. Ah, Northern
Okay. Hardback or paperback?
hardback.
Your favorite flower?
Oh, Lily of the Valley.
Favorite wine?
Favorite wine. Oh, a really good Pinot Noir, a really good one.
Do you prefer the cooking, the eating, or both?
I like them both equally.
Do you have a literary BFF that you go to? Like, who's your best friend in the writing world?
Oh gosh. So many.
I'm asking some hard
Oh
ones.
my gosh. This is the best community in the world of friends. I honestly, Ariel Lahan is such a good friend, Christina McMorris, Patty Callahan, Michelle Gable. Um, those come up right off top of my head, but there's so many people that I feel like are just good friends.
Well, I love that writing community. It just seems so strong. Uh,
Mhm.
one more question, quick. What's something that you like that got left out of the book?
Oh, you know what? I have like 20,000 words of Amaryllis's experiences at the orphanage that didn't get into the book. And I realized that they didn't need to be there. It took me a while to be convinced of that, but it's true. But I have them. So I'm thinking that after the paperback comes out, and it does come out on March 5th. So if anybody wants to get a copy for a friend or whatever, and they prefer to buy a paperback, it comes out on March 5th. I think after that's been out for a little while and people have a chance to read it who are waiting for the paperback, I will put those together as a free PDF download on my website so that you can just read what Amaryllis was doing during those 8 years before Helen found her.
What a treat, people. That is awesome. Thank you so much for that, Susan. We're going to be looking out for it. All right, we have questions lined up. So I'm going to start spotlighting people. Cindy, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Susan. Long time no see.
Hey, yeah, right?
Yeah. Thanks again for such a fun weekend. I loved it. So ever since you brought up doing your research for the nature of fragile things and you found that banner, that sign for eugenics, it just made me think about like what other kinds of things have you stumbled upon that have just like sparked an interest or just a fun fact or I mean anything. I just think you probably come across quite a bit of stuff when you're doing your research.
Yeah. You know, I have this one article that I think it was in the New York Times, maybe, and it was like 5 or 6 years ago. And I cut it out and saved it. And it was all about abandoned amusement parks. And for I don't know what reason, but it just stood out to me. It was like trying to imagine if all of a sudden one day Disneyland was an abandoned amusement park. When you think about how many like special memories are made, especially if you're a young child at a place like that. So someday, I don't know, I just might, I don't know what I'll do with that, but it piqued my interest. I cut it out and I saved it. The other one I think was I don't know how I can do this, but I've always wondered what happened to the family in the Grapes of Wrath at the end of the book. Like, if I could imagine like taking it forward, I don't even know if I have the guts or the chops to attempt it. But when you think of Rose of Sharon, I don't know if you've read the Grapes of Wrath, but I just like what if I could imagine her beyond that last page, like into the future, could I tackle something like that? Those are two things that are just on the back burner, just sitting there.
Well, if
Great
you write it, I'm going to read it.
Thanks.
question, Cindy. I love that. And I would encourage you to do it, especially even if it's a twist, like kind of how Anne Napolitano with Hello, Beautiful and Little Women, like
Right.
give it your own. Like
Yeah, that's true.
I would
Yeah.
love that. All right, we have another fan, Anissa. Go ahead.
Thank you, LB. It's good to see you again, Susan.
And you?
Thank you. You answered this question kind of, sort of, but I think I want to get a little bit deeper into it. I was just curious, was there a certain time in your writing with way back maybe or whatever with any of your books that you decided that you kind of wanted to tackle some of these hard subjects, even though I assume that it's very hard at times to write it. Was there something specifically that kind of, you know, pushed you in helping you decide how, you know, what books you wanted to write?
That's a really good question. I think what it was is I was writing different kinds of books before 2008. And then in 2008, I had this idea for a dual timeline story about a current day college student who was transcribing the very old 400-year-old diary of a witness to the Salem witch trials. So this diary is owned by a woman in Santa Barbara, and she's going to the university there, and she takes this part-time job transcribing it because the paper is falling apart. And so she's typing it into a computer. And so we have this college student reading this diary, and then we have the pages of the diary too. So the two girls, they're both about the same age, around 20, and their lives are very, very different. And the college student is looking at what happened in the Salem witch trials, about how groupthink and following the crowd, and how fear can take over, and she's assimilating it all into the current day. And I did it because I was in a play once a long time ago, and I was in junior high, where I played a young girl who accuses another of witchcraft to get out of being accused of witchcraft herself. And I remember how awful it felt, being that character in that play, and it just stuck with me all these years. And I knew that when I was writing about the Salem witch trials, I wasn't writing about a historical event as much as I was writing about, this is what happens when you go, when you just take an idea and you don't think about what you're doing, and you start prejudging people and allowing groupthink and crowd fear to dictate your actions. And when I wrote that book, and people it was my first starred review in Publishers Weekly, and people just I found all kinds of new readers, and I realized that people, they do want to know about the hard things we've gone through. They do. I mean, some people, all they want is the rom-com, and which is fine, but some people, they want that and this, or they want only this. Like they just want this. They just want to read something that's going to challenge their thinking, or make them decide what kind of human they're going to be. And I just realized that that's the kind of book I like reading too. I like to read books that challenge my thinking. I want to finish a book, put it down, and feel like I've been changed somehow, either in the way I think or in the way I choose to be from that day on, even if it's just a little tiny pivot. And so I think that's when it happened. It was in 2008.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Was beautiful. I don't know about y'all, but I have the chill bumps. Like Susan, I think you just said it. Like, I want something out of it. Like, I hunger for it. So it's just, all right, Janelyn, you are up. Go ahead.
Hi, it's nice to meet you.
Hi.
I just have a quick comment. I want you to know that eugenics is not by the wayside in my history classes that I teach at the college level. So every semester I teach at least one section of American history, and we cover the progressive era. And I talk about eugenics, and my students know about it. And I also talk about the euthanasia program that Hitler started. And I also talk about the Lebensborn program that is more in historical fiction now. So
Thank you.
so it's I don't know how widespread my reach is, but my students at least know about it.
I'm so glad to hear that, because I didn't hear it in college or in high school. And so I'm really glad you're doing that. And my hat's off to you.
Thank you.
Hats off to all those teachers out there doing their best and teaching those kids. Thank you so much, Janelyn. All right, Carol, I'm going to spotlight you now. Go ahead.
Hi, Susan. So
Hi.
great to meet you. I was curious, when you were doing your research, were you able to visit Sonoma County? I know it was during COVID, and I wondered if you were able to visit Sonoma County, and more specifically, did you visit what is now the Sonoma Developmental Center in person?
I actually did. In fact, I have a picture here. This is what it looks like today. This was in 2020 or 20, no, not 2020, 2021, when we could finally go places again. So this building here still stands. It's boarded up. There's some chain link fence here over the entrance. So they're not using it anymore. The developmental center closed, I want to say, several years ago. And in its last life, that building was for a good purpose. It was helping people with developmental disabilities get occupational training and things like that. But that is the place where in California, they sterilized more people than any other institution in California, was the Sonoma State Home, which is why I patterned my facility that Rosanne is taken to after that one, because people who know anything about it would recognize it. But I decided to make it fictional so that I could control everything about it, and so that I could have my character, Dr. Townsend, kind of be the voice of the eugenic thinkers, so that you as the reader could kind of hear what they were thinking. So it's in a beautiful area. Sonoma County is beautiful. It's just really odd that there would be that building doing
Right.
that type of activity in this just gorgeous location. I think it's very ironic that it happened in such a pretty place.
Yeah, it is ironic. I live in the area, and it was all so new to me. I was absolutely blown away by the book, and I just I was shocked. I mean, I'm right here, and it just I just went down a rabbit hole. I couldn't stop doing
Yeah.
research. It was just incredible. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Question, Carol, and I think it probably brought up lots of good questions for book club discussion. So definitely recommend it out that way. Mary Ellen, will you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Susan.
Hi.
I'm wondering, now that the book's been out for almost a year and you've had lots of opportunities to get feedback and talk to people, what has maybe surprised you, or what has been the most exciting thing that's come up as a result of writing this book?
Gosh, what a great question. I think one of the things that surprised me was that there seemed to be a lot of people asking me, did it take a lot of courage to write about such a difficult topic? And they almost make it seem like I was taking a risk by writing about it, like a personal risk, either to my career or even maybe my person, about writing about it. And that just never occurred to me. And even now, I don't think of it as too dangerous a topic to touch, because it happened. It's not like I'm imagining a world that we have never experienced and asking people, okay, imagine this, if you will, and see what you think. I'm taking you back to the past and showing you this is exactly how it was. So I never felt like I was in danger of damaging my career or losing readers. It just never occurred to me. And it's still, even now, I still don't think it was too difficult a topic to touch. And maybe it's just because I view it as something we just need to know, we need to remember, that kind of thing. But that did surprise me, that people would think that I worried or that I was taking a risk. It just never occurred to me.
That is interesting. And I think it's like you said at the beginning, it's so important that we're reminded that
Mm,
it wasn't that many years ago we were having these thoughts, and it could happen again, and we want to make sure it doesn't happen
right,
again.
right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Helpful question, Mary Ellen, and Barbara just said the exact same thing Mary Ellen did. We have another question. Jenna, why don't you go ahead and unmute?
Hi.
Hey.
My question is, so when you were writing this, I was wondering if you ever kind of dreamed up a scenario where Amaryllis reunited with her half brother, and if you imagined like what his reaction to her would have been.
Yeah, I did wonder, like, where else can I take this story? Like, what does the story need to be told? And it did occur to me, should there be a point where Helen takes Amaryllis to the vineyard and at some point meets Wilson? And what would the benefit to that be? How would it make the story better, or does the story need that angle? And when I was teasing at that, nothing just came of it. And I thought, I think the best thing would be is just for Wilson to grow away. And so he grows away even from his own mother, and he just kind of severs the tie so that, we end up having terrible Celine is alone there. She's pretty much just, all she has is herself and her regrets and her bitterness, which is sad. And she's a whole nother character we could probably talk about, but it just seemed like I could not see where the story needed that to happen. But I did wonder, because you're right. It's like, should they have met, and would they have a relationship? Plus, I leave the story, at that, pretty much in the hotel, and she's only 18. Like, it's possible that she might on her own reach out, to find Wilson. And I feel like it's kind of nice for you as the reader, and me to maybe to imagine, like, where are these characters 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And which is really actually a really good book club question, is, can you imagine in 5 or 10 years Amaryllis reaching out to Wilson to have a relationship with him, and what might happen if she did?
Agreed. Jenna, I was on the same lines, because we're not getting to these questions, but in my hypothetical world, I wanted to know, like, does Celine end up alone? What happened? Like, where do you see Belle? What about Martine? Like, there are so many questions you could ask in your book club. And I think that's why this is the perfect book for it. So thanks for that great question. Marcy did ask a question in the chat box that I don't want to miss. She said, what are you researching now? And I'm going to push it a little bit further. Can you tell us about what you're writing, or is that top secret?
No, I can tell you about it now. I feel like we just landed on a title finally, and I just turned it in. Like, it's on its third revision, and it's probably going to come out this time next year. So it's still a year out, but this is the time when the book is usually done, and it just starts to enter the production phase. But it's called A Map to Paradise, and it's about 3 women in the 1950s. So it's during the Cold War, it's post World War II, which I feel like is a good decade now. We've had a lot of really great World War II books, but people are probably hungry maybe for what happened next. Well, what happened next was the Cold War. And you would think that the 1950s would be a time of great peace and prosperity, but they were actually very stressful and very fearful because of the Cold War. We didn't know what the Soviet Union was going to do. And everybody knew that we all had the bomb. And that's what frightened people the most, was it felt like home, with capital H, was in danger. And so fear was huge, and McCarthyism was a real thing. And it was all driven by fear of the unknown and fear of the enemy we couldn't see. And so these 3 women are all kind of impacted by that idea that home is at risk. Home, to be displaced from home is probably one of the worst feelings there is. One of the women is a DP. She's a displaced person from Eastern Europe. There were 1 million of them after World War II who had no home to go back to, or did not want to go home, because home meant going to now an Eastern Bloc country. So the United States took in about 400,000 DPs, and she's one of them. And she's working as a maid to a Hollywood starlet who's on the cusp of her career when she's blacklisted for being a communist sympathizer. She is not, but she knows somebody who is, and that's all it took. During the blacklist era of Hollywood, it's the craziest thing that's where people were looking for communists, was in Hollywood. Go figure, but a great many directors, writers, and actors came under scrutiny for being communist sympathizers, and many of them couldn't get work for a decade or more. And no studio would hire them if her name was on the blacklist. So for her, she's been displaced from the only career she's ever wanted. And then the other one is a woman taking care of her agoraphobic brother-in-law. If he dies, she has nothing, and he's not well. So they're all facing the loss of home, either physically or just the idea of, everywhere I find my sense of belonging, which matters to us greatly, is at risk. What am I going to do to either get it back or to protect it? And wouldn't it be nice if there was a map to paradise, if there was a map that showed you how to hang on to the place where you are most at peace and at rest. And so their lives are going to merge and converge. And that's all I'm going to tell you about that.
We're ready for that Meissner connection.
Yes.
Tell us the title one more time, because people were wanting to add it to their
Sure.
want to read list.
Yeah, it's probably not on Goodreads yet, but it's called A Map to Paradise. But if you subscribe to my newsletter, and I only send one out 4 to 6 times a year, I always keep people in the know of stuff like that. And it's just on my website. There's an easy link to click on that.
Thank you for that. And thank you for all your involvement too on Instagram. We love to get all that inside scoop. We are over time, but I do have one more question. Do you have time?
Yeah.
What are you reading, and what would you recommend to this group, to your fans?
Oh gosh, let's see. Right now I'm reading The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters, and it's a heartbreaker, and but it's so well written. So it's not that I don't recommend it. You just know that you're probably going to need some Kleenex, and that's okay. It's okay. You just need to know it's about a child abduction, but it's just masterfully written. And I'm reading Kristen Hanna's The Women right now, which she's terrific, and I'm only halfway through that. I usually have 3 books going at once. And I also just finished Little Monsters by Adrienne. I'm going to mess up her last name, but it was a very interesting book. It's kind of like a family dynamics book, if you like family dynamics, especially flawed family dynamics. Yeah, it was very interesting. I liked it a lot. My favorite book, I think, from this year so far, let's see, gosh, I keep going back to my favorite from last year, which is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. I just loved it. I also loved Kate Morton's newest, and also Kate Morton's The Secret Keeper, which is not due, but I love this book. And then, of course, Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. I loved it, loved it. And then anything by Ann Patchett, I will read. This is State of Wonder, but I have other of her books that are really good, like Tom Lake. If you haven't read Tom Lake, it's a really good, easy, quiet read. It doesn't demand a lot of you, but it just really kind of settles into your heart. She's a masterful storyteller.
Absolutely. Susan, I think you need to just join the LBs, because you pretty much read what we are reading. And I'm just so thankful that you are here tonight. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. Readers, thank you so much for joining. Please make sure you check out her website. You heard reading guides, you heard newsletter. She has a great Instagram as well. And if you can follow the LBs, I'm on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Hopefully you can find me somewhere there. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is just the first 2024 author chat. And drum roll, that was a great segue, Susan. First, though, we have debut author Charmaine Wilkerson for The Black Cake coming up next week. So in 1 week, but in 2 weeks, The Berry Pickers. So I hope you can come back maybe and ask Amanda your own question, because we would love to have you.
I'll be hopping along for that one.
We all love to highlight and give some exposure to these debut authors as they are kicking off their writing journey. But I'm just so excited. Charmaine's is a great way to celebrate Black History Month. So if you haven't read that, and if you don't already know, Oprah has made it into a Hulu series. So there's always great incentive there too, to have read it before you watch the series. But it was just such a great night. I just so appreciate you being here, Susan, and sharing all of the inside scoop on this novel. It's so beautiful, and I still think about it all the time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure, honestly. Great questions too.
Well, thank y'all, everybody. Everybody have a good night, and I'll see you in 1 week.
All right, bye. Good night.